Bom dia a todos, a todas e todes. Hello, everyone from all over the world. It's a pleasure to join you here today again with our seminar, the International Seminar Vygotsky and Marx, with our dear friend, Professor Peter Jones from the University of Sheffield. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you this friend who has taught us so much about Vygotsky, Marx, and so many other issues that he has discussed with us throughout the years. Today, we are once again here to learn more about how we can see Vygotsky and Marx, how we can expand our ideas. And I'm particularly happy to be with Cecilia, Viviane, and my dear friend, Ia, back to our activities in here today. It's a great honor to be also part of this group, of this research. I would like to thank our interpreters, both sign language interpreters and English language interpreters, and I will give you some advice. I'll do it in English, and then I'll say it in Portuguese for those who are on Facebook. So, first of all, para aqueles que estão aqui com a gente na sala e quiserem ouvir em português, vocês precisam entrar em interpretação na parte de baixo da nossa tela, onde tem escrito interpretação, vocês se trocam para português. E quem quiser ouvir só em inglês, troca para inglês. Quando houver falas em português, vocês vão poder ouvir a fala em inglês nesse canal e vice-versa. Para quem está na internet e não tem acesso, pode colocar aí um pedido e quem sabe a gente consegue mandar o link para que vocês entrem aqui e possam participar em português. Ok. As for the English people, English-speaking persons, you can choose on the bottom part of our screen the interpretation button, and you can change to English when we speak Portuguese. If you want to ask questions, you can send your questions through our chat, and we are going to read them to Peter as soon as he ends his first presentation. So we thank you all for being here. We thank PUC São Paulo for the support, PIPEC, and all the students and participants who have helped us create this place and this communication. So thank you very much. And Peter, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and greetings to everyone. It's lovely to be with you again. Lovely to have the opportunity to be in dialogue with you, and I thank you all for that. Today I'm going to look at some of the main problems that we chose to discuss at the beginning. So let me share my screen with you, if I may, and show you what I had in mind for that. So this is obviously the third session in our series, and I wanted to focus particularly on what are some extraordinarily difficult and complex issues, I think, which are unresolved, I would say, but which I think are worthy of attention in terms of our overall interest in the relationship between Marx and Vygotsky. And so let me start by outlining what I think those issues are. I'll just first of all give a brief overview of the series, of what we're trying to do overall, and then the main topic and issues today, ending with a suggestion for the final two sessions of our series. So the series clearly, as Fernanda has said, is looking at the relationship between the fundamental ideas and methodology of Marx and Vygotsky. In that subject area, there are 5 groups of problems which we've chosen to focus on: Marx's dialectical method and the germ cell method of capital, issues of decolonization, issues of ethnocentrism and evolutionism in Marx and Vygotsky. Thirdly, Vygotsky's method in working towards a Marxist psychology, and finally, stages in the development of that work by Vygotsky towards a psychological theory involving the key semiotic and linguistic constructs. So that is quite some program, I have to say. So far we've been concentrating, I think, on probably number 1 and number 3. So today, I think, where I'd like to shift is towards the second area in particular. So Marx's method, but in relation to the questions of decolonization, in particular issues of ethnocentrism and evolutionism in Marx and Vygotsky. And in that light, Vygotsky's method of working towards a Marxist psychology and some of the stages in that journey. So that's what I thought we might have a look at today. Last time we ended with a very interesting discussion, I think, about the implications of these ideas for schools in Brazil and for the progressive role of teachers in dialogue and social transformation. I hope we will be able to return to those questions, perhaps in later seminars, but this time I thought it might be useful for us to look straight on at some of the, let's say, not more important, but perhaps more basic questions which don't directly relate necessarily to our struggles on a daily basis, but have to do with the basic conceptualizations that we're dealing with and the implications of those. So I hope some of what I say will be interesting, and I look forward to your questions as ever on where we'll go from here. So I'll speak probably for about an hour or so. There is a lot to say on this, so I will try and keep it within that time frame. We can always catch up on some of these issues at a later stage, but I'll try and make as much progress as possible. So I think the questions that this particular topic brings are to do with conceptions of historical development, and in particular direction of development. For example, does Marx assume or claim a model of universal, unilinear human social development or direction? Does Vygotsky make such assumptions about a universal human psychological development? What would be the implications for psychology if Marx did have such a perspective? And what would be the implications if he didn't? Now, in Marx's assertions about historical development of social formations, what does he say or imply about the development of consciousness and or of mental, psychological faculties or properties of the community or individual person? In other words, what does Marx himself say that's relevant to, perhaps relevant to, the development of a psychological theory? And in that light, are the claims which Vygotsky makes about historical or ontogenetic development of higher psychical or mental functions, are they consistent or compatible with Marx's views? And are they plausible? Now, I think you will therefore understand what I mean by complex and difficult questions. Each of these is worthy of a book or several volumes of study in its own right. They're very difficult questions, which I'm struggling with all the time. Sometimes I think I know the answer, and then I read something and I think about it and I realize I don't know the answer. So this is a state of flux, let us say, and I hope to hear your own views on some of these as we go through. Now, one intellectual exercise that we may engage in is in thinking about Marx's method in relation to the way that Vygotsky approaches creating a Marxist psychology. Let's assume that we hadn't read any of Vygotsky's works, but we were interested, perhaps as Marxists, in pursuing the implications of Marx's materialistic conception of history for a potential science or a critical perspective on psychology. Where would we start? Where would you start with that, I wonder? Well, you might think that the easiest thing to do is to go to Marx's writings. In particular, given Vygotsky's emphasis on understanding human consciousness as the necessary task of a new science of human psychology, that we might go to Marx's views on that to see what he says, at least, and to see what general principles there might be. So I've picked out a few just for interest's sake. The question being, I think, which I'm not going to answer, but the question being, to what extent might we see these principles or claims at work in Vygotsky, or do we see a completely new and distinctive approach rather than the things that we might expect to see? So first of all, for example, the materialistic conception of history, in which, as Marx says in Capital, human history is looked at as a natural history. He talks about a natural history of human society in Capital. And what's the summary of that? Well, this conception of history, this is from the German ideology, by the way, which one needs to understand that this is a work that Vygotsky never read. It wasn't published at that time. But this conception of history depends on our ability to expound the real process of production, Marx says, starting out from the material production of life itself, and to comprehend the form of intercourse, in other words, social relations and so on, connected with this and created by this mode of production, i.e. civil society in its various stages, as the basis of all history, and to show it in its action as state, to explain all the different theoretical products and forms of consciousness, religion, philosophy, ethics, etc., and trace their origins and growth from that basis, by which means, of course, the whole thing can be depicted in its totality, and therefore, too, the reciprocal action of these various sides on one another. Notice that Marx emphasizes all the different theoretical products and forms of consciousness. And in the light of that particular method, for example, there's a very brief section called Forms of Social Consciousness. And Marx says there is no history of politics, law, science, art, religion. In other words, you can't write a separate history of these things, because to understand all of these things, you must follow the method outlined. In other words, starting out from the material production of life itself, and so on and so forth. And of course, in that light, one may ask about particular approaches to things. So is there to be a history of, let's say, higher mental functions? Is that part of the game? Or in his early writings, Marx talks about industry as the open book of human psychology. And in the German ideology, this kind of idea is amplified. The multitude of productive forces accessible to men determines the nature of society. Hence, the history of humanity must always be studied and treated in relation to the history of industry and exchange. Or we might go to a different insight that Marx provides on social, again in the German ideology, when he says, by social we understand the cooperation of several individuals, no matter under what conditions, in what manner, and to what end. And so one might imagine beginning a psychology with a concrete study or studies of cooperation, social cooperation. Or finally, the final one that I'll select is number 6. This is something which the Soviet philosopher Evald Ilyenkov spent some time on himself in his book, The Abstract and the Concrete in Marx's Capital. The idea that, an idea that wasn't his own, but which Marx liked, was the idea of human beings as tool-making animals, the human as a tool-making animal. And so a particular germ cell approach to human social being in some detail is expounded in Ilyenkov's book, where he tries to develop that thought, explain it, and to examine the consequences of that particular formulation for an understanding of human social being. Now, how do these ideas relate to Vygotsky's project? Well, that's debatable. But a key point, of course, is that Marx, in making these fairly general statements and claims, did not at all discuss how these general principles or assumptions might be concretely developed in terms of forms of consciousness or psychological capacities in the collective or in the individuals. And of course, nothing at all about children's development and child development. And this, as we know, is where Vygotsky comes in. So, of course, in relation to all this, Vygotsky's first innovation beyond the Marxist texts is to set as his focus the ontogenetic development of children's mental capacities, the development of higher mental functions in the child. And that, of course, then raises a whole other set of issues as to how that study might relate to any of those principles in Marx, and in particular, how it might relate. Now, I'm going to leave those thoughts at that point and move on to look at another problem, which is relevant, and I'll try to show how it's relevant in a bit. But this is the question of ethnocentrism and universality or unilinearity. First of all, in Marx. The question being, to what extent did Marx claim or assume a single line of human historical development or lineage? You may wonder why this is such an issue, but I'll try and explain that in a while. But the first thing is, did Marx have such a view? Now, I'm going to quote a few scholars on this subject to see what you make of it, and then have a look at Marx's a passage from Marx's Capital in various translations so that we can see one of the things that Marx said which might be relevant to this and to see what we make of it. So I'm quoting first of all from a piece by Derek Sayer and Philip Corrigan, Late Marx, Continuity, Contradiction and Learning. And they say at times, Marx certainly adopted an evolutionist idiom in the presentation of his general conclusions, as in the quotes, progressive epochs in the economic formation of society of the 1859 preface. Actually, the thing in brackets there is from me. Clearly, even if Marx did have such an evolutionist view, it would not have much to say about communities which, over tens of thousands of years or more, up to this day, had not stepped on that particular ladder of so-called progress. So in other words, we have to be very cautious about this. But what the authors are suggesting is that at times Marx did assume or claim that the whole of human history could be seen in terms of some kind of universal or unilinear process of development going through so-called progressive stages. They continue. He had obvious enough reasons for claiming scientific status for these theories and for drawing attention to their affinities with theories in natural science, which also upheld the mutability of the world and the role of struggle and advancement. But whether Capital and other works by the mature Marx rest on an essential kernel of evolutionism in any stronger sense than this is a more difficult question. This is how Kevin Anderson puts it in a great book on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies from Marxist perspective, Marx at the Margins. I would highly recommend this book. It's very interesting, and it also has an examination of Marx's ethnological notebooks, his notes on books about all kinds of societies and histories of societies throughout the world, including Latin America, by the way. Now, this is what Anderson says. Marx's critique of capital was far broader than is usually supposed. To be sure, he concentrated on the labor-capital relation within Western Europe and North America. But at the same time, he expended considerable time and energy on the analysis of non-Western societies, as well as that of race, ethnicity, and nationalism. Okay, so far so good. Next sentence. While some of these writings show a problematically unilinear perspective and on occasion traces of ethnocentrism, the overall trajectory of Marx's writings on these issues moves in a different direction. The foregoing discussion has shown Marx to have created a multilinear and non-reductionist theory of history, to have analyzed the complexities and differences of non-Western societies, and to have refused to bind himself into a single model of development or revolution. So in other words, Anderson is saying this is where Marx was going. This is his direction of travel. And I think that that is incontestable when you look at the later works and the later interests of Marx. However, as Anderson says, in some of his writings, there is a problematically unilinear perspective and traces, putting it mildly, I would say, of ethnocentrism. So the question is, to what extent does that unilinear perspective and these traces of ethnocentrism, to what extent do they persist in Marx's mature work as well as his earlier work? And what consequences are there of those things, those problematic things, for our thinking about a Marxist psychology and for how a Marxist psychology has been conceived? And these issues are by no means of a merely academic nature. Marx's view on unilinear development, for example, multiple roads for different communities and societies. In the Russian Revolution, in the Russian revolutionary movement, had an absolutely pivotal role to play. Again, as Anderson shows in his book. For example, he quotes Leon Trotsky. This is from 1933, commenting on how Marx presented the relevance of his analysis of capital for other countries, based on Marx's own research in England. At an earlier point in Marx's writing, he had appeared to claim that the example of England, of capitalist development in England, showed to all other countries their future. In other words, he presented his analysis in Capital as relevant to the whole of the developing world in the sense of all the world. And this is what Trotsky says in 1933. This statement of Marx, which takes as its point of departure methodologically, not from world economy as a whole, but from the single capitalist country as a type, has become less applicable in proportion as capitalist evolution has embraced all countries, regardless of their previous fate and industrial level. England in her day revealed the future of France, considerably less of Germany, but not in the least of Russia and not of India. The Russian Mensheviks, however, took this conditional statement of Marx unconditionally. Backward Russia, they said, ought not to push ahead, but humbly to follow the prepared models. To this kind of Marxism, the liberals also agreed. In other words, in the Russian revolutionary movement, one of the pivotal splits occurred between those sections which had been a single party, between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, precisely around the questions of political strategy, given their understanding of the relevance of Marxism to the Russian situation. And it was the Bolsheviks, in effect, who were prepared to look beyond what the old-fashioned Marxism of the Mensheviks told them. But in that, of course, they were, as Anderson and others have shown, also following Marx's lead, because Marx had revised his view of the social political development of Europe and Russia as a whole in a way which supported the Bolshevik views. But nevertheless, this shows that how we conceive the historical developments and continuities, the lines of development in social history, has profound implications for how we understand political strategy, our own politics at any point, and at what is possible and what is necessary to achieve in political terms. So these things are of a highly important and vital political character. Now that's looking at things from a kind of a general perspective about the development of types of social production, if you like. But what then about the issue of development of consciousness, psychological capacities? What did Marx have to say on that? Well, actually a lot. And there's certainly a lot in the German ideology, for example, on human consciousness. But again, we need to be very careful. The German ideology as a text, it was unpublished, of course, but it was written by Marx and Engels 1845 to 1846. This was even before Darwin's work on evolution. And so in that work, in the German ideology, Marx and Engels didn't even know anything about evolution. And they thought that human beings had been created by spontaneous generation. So anything dealing with early humanity and the development of humanity needs to be taken extremely cautiously when we're looking at these works. But this is what he said in Capital. For example, I've just chosen this as an example of something. He's talking about particular types of economic activity, in particular mercantilism or commercial type activity of a particular kind. And he's saying those ancient social organisms of production are much more simple and transparent, he's saying, than those of bourgeois society. But now listen to the next bit. But they are founded either on the immaturity of man as an individual, when he has not yet torn himself loose from the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with other men, or on direct relations of dominance and servitude. They're conditioned by a low stage of development of the productive powers of labor and correspondingly limited relations between men within the process of creating and reproducing their material life. Hence also limited relations between man and nature. These real limitations are reflected in the ancient worship of nature and in other elements of tribal religion. Now, there are a number of issues here, I think. Clearly, Marx is assuming that alongside and as part of the development of the productive forces, productive powers generally, there are recognizable and identifiable developments in terms of religion, in terms of how people see themselves, and therefore in terms of consciousness, individual consciousness, as well as a kind of collective consciousness. That's assumed here. That doesn't mean to say it's right, but we can see that Marx is drawing parallels or making connections between these in terms of an overall theory of human development. But what does he mean by the immaturity of man as an individual when he has not yet torn himself loose from the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with other men? What on earth does that actually mean? I leave you to ponder. But it's interesting to see how this has been translated. So I just had a look at different translations of this to see what they would have made of it. So this is the passage. The immaturity of man as an individual. when he's not yet torn himself loose from the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with other men. What does this actually mean? What foundations are there for this assertion? And is there warrant here? Is there something here that a Vygotsky might have taken up and assumed? But it's interesting to note how this passage has been translated. There is a Portuguese translation from the website. So there we go. Now, as you can see, it also talks about the immaturity of the individual man who hasn't yet been able to detach himself from the umbilical cord of natural species connection, of the natural species connection with others, or on relations, immediate relations of dominance and servitude and so on. I looked at the German translation, and that is pretty much the same. The immaturity of the individual human being who has not yet cut himself loose from the umbilical cord of the natural species connection with others. Then if we look at the French edition, this is the first French edition. You see that they've translated it slightly differently. The immaturity of the individual man, whose historical development has not yet, so to speak, cut the umbilical cord which unites him with the natural community of a primitive tribe, or conditions of despotism and slavery. So now we've got a primitive tribe coming into the whole thing. The later French translation doesn't have that. The umbilical cord of the natural species connections he has with others, or on the immediate relations of domination and servitude. So I think there are a number of issues here as to what Marx means by this, and on what basis he could possibly be claiming this immaturity of human beings, of the individual human being. Where do we see this natural species connection that people have with others? And indeed, what is a natural species connection for human beings? What does that consist of? What is it? And what evidence is there for that? I think these are problems which I won't dwell on, but they certainly are not easy to grasp. And as you can see from the first translation, maybe somebody just thought it was easier to put primitive tribe in there rather than natural species connection. Maybe they just had no clue what that was, or they thought that that's what Marx meant. And so the lesson, of course, being that what Marx might have meant by that isn't clear, and could have been used as a license or a warrant to think about Marx talking about psychological development or the development of consciousness from primitive tribes to modern human beings, something along those lines. Now, the ethnocentrism, which Anderson mentioned in Marx, has certainly been a topic of considerable scholarly debate and controversy, as has his overall theory of social development. And so I wanted to show you one work in particular that takes this up and is very critical of Marx from a decolonial perspective. This is from a book by Bambra and Homewood called Colonialism and Modern Social Theory from 2021. It's a book that I would certainly highly recommend for its critique of all the main Western social theorists, including Marx, of course. But they take issue with not just Marx's social theory, if you like, political and economic theory, but also with his with the general views about development of or progress in human development and so on. So they say, we've argued that Marx's account of the global significance of capitalism was organized around a strongly Eurocentric account of social class. Our concern has been to show how this account was organized around a telos of class struggle that placed the dialectic of capital and commodified free labor power at the center. And I don't think that Marx would have disagreed with that, but they are critical of that. The authors examine not only the broader outlines of theories of political economy and social structure, but consider the effects and consequences of colonialism on the colonizer's view of colonized and subjugated peoples. So this is what they say on that. The modern world, they say, has been significantly shaped through historical processes and structures that have been in place since the late 15th century. These have formed our institutions and fashioned our understandings. Others, that's to say, non-Western peoples, were initially understood as non-believers. They weren't Christian. But by the mid to late 18th century, they were considered ancestors. As John Locke, the English philosopher, wrote in the late 17th century, in the beginning, all the world was America. That is, in their discovery of the Americas, Europeans believed that they were encountering earlier versions of themselves. This laid the groundwork for particular understandings of hierarchies among populations across the world. If those peoples encountered by early European travelers were effectively understood as being, in sociological terms, their ancestors, the Europeans could both show them their predetermined future and be unconcerned about their passing away. The former was sanctioned by the belief in progress. The latter suggested that the disappearance of other cultures and peoples was not a consequence of European actions, but a quasi-natural phenomenon. In this way, Europeans justified to themselves their domination of others. And this justification was incorporated into modern social theory as secular justifications replaced religious ones. And I think this is very important, this idea of other peoples as our ancestors, and that we, modern civilized people, have made such progress from our ancestors in terms of our consciousness, our technology, our morals, our ways of thinking and behavior. This, of course, is absolutely the message of many of the scholarly or less scholarly works written particularly in the 19th century by colonial, by missionaries, by colonial administrators, by researchers, and so on and so forth. And of course, if we, before we turn to Vygotsky himself, should note the very strong presence of similar perceptions and beliefs among the Russian revolutionary movement itself. For example, in Nikolai Bukharin's book, Bukharin was one of the main Bolshevik leaders and published a textbook called Historical Materialism, a System of Sociology, in 1921, which was very popular and went through several editions. In here, we find a view of cognitive history in terms of the degree of abstractness, for example, which verbal concepts have attained, the progress in abstraction, in other words, in intellectual power. And Bukharin actually quotes approvingly from Lévi-Brühl, one of these scholars who studied, let's say, other peoples, and whose 1910 book, in English, How Natives Think, or in French, The Mental Functions in Lower Societies. I think probably lower rather than inferior, or although inférieur could be. And Bukharin argues that primitive mentality is pre-logical, that's to say, incapable of generalization or abstraction. And so in understanding how the Russian revolutionaries themselves, whatever the consequences of their actions for the anti-colonial movement, which was enormous, you can see that their own Western education, their own sense of themselves and so on, licensed this view of other peoples in precisely the terms that Bamber and Home would discuss. So when we move on to Vygotsky then, having talked a lot about Marx and the context, the question is to what extent Vygotsky's starting points and method align with some of those kind of ingredients of Marx's approach. And it's worth then looking at his own rationale for the approach that he takes and the assumptions he makes. So here I'm jumping forward from the very early works that we were looking at before in the mid 1920s to works which are considered to be squarely representative of the distinctive cultural historical psychology that he developed over several years, including works in the early 1930s, one of which, unpublished, it was an unpublished manuscript, is called History of Development of the Higher Mental or Higher Psychological Functions. And in the light of what we've just been looking at, I thought I'd quote some passages from the beginning of this book. Now, as we'll see, Vygotsky talks about modern or cultured or cultural people in relation to and as distinct from primitive people. So it's in that context that we're looking at that. And he says the behavior of a modern cultural adult is the result of two different processes of mental development. On the one hand, it's the process of biological evolution of animal species, leading to the appearance of the species Homo sapiens. On the other is the process of historical development, by means of which the primordial, primitive person, man, became cultured or was transformed into the cultural person. Both processes, biological and cultural development of behavior, are represented in phylogenesis separately and as autonomous and independent lines of development, comprising the substance of separate, autonomous mental disciplines. In other words, the disciplines of biological development of evolution and the historical development of culture. And in terms of child psychology, he's saying that this creates the fundamental problem. All the originality, all difficulty of the problem of the development of higher mental functions of the child consists in that both these lines, the natural and the cultural, in other words, are merged in ontogenesis and actually form a single, although complex, process. Note the term higher mental functions itself, or higher psychological functions. We'll return to that point. Now he's elaborating on the point he made before about these independent and autonomous disciplines. He says, while ethnic psychology, psychology of primitive peoples, and comparative psychology, biological evolutionary psychology, which each deal with one of two lines of phylogenetic development of behavior, have both long been aware of their subject. They've had a clear subject matter, in other words. The representatives of these sciences would never think of these processes as identical, or consider the development of man from primitive to cultured as a simple continuation of development from animal to man, or reduce cultural development of behavior to biological. But this, he says, is specifically what's done at each step in child psychology. So he's criticizing contemporary child psychology for confusing these two lines or identifying them in some way. So the lesson for ontogenesis for Vygotsky is the following: that in the development of the child, two types of mental development, or in Russian, both types of psychological development, are represented, not repeated, which we find in an isolated form in phylogenesis: biological and historical, or natural and cultural development of behavior. In other words, in phylogenesis, in the history of the species, the history of humanity, we find these two things quite separate. We find biological evolution on the one hand, and historical development, historical cultural development, as quite separate lines. But in ontogenesis, then, these processes have their analogues, he says, not parallels. And this is a central point of departure for our research, differentiating two lines of mental development of the child corresponding to the two lines of phylogenetic development of behavior, although these two lines are merged. So in other words, Vygotsky is not saying that we've got to forget any talk of phylogenetic development. That's what happened in history. That's not relevant to the child development. No, he's saying, yes, that is one of the lines of child development. Cultural development of the child, he says, is still characterized primarily by the fact that it occurs under conditions of dynamic change in organic type. It's superimposed on processes of growth, maturation, and organic development of the child, and forms a single whole with these. Only by abstraction can we separate some processes from others. And so he says, we will turn occasionally, for heuristic purposes, to the data of phylogenesis in those cases where there is a need for a pure and clear determination of basic initial concepts of cultural development of behavior. Now, this is very important because what he's saying is that the study of the historical development of human psychology, what he calls ethnic psychology, that study has given this view of a pure and clear determination of the basic initial concepts of cultural development of behavior. That's been found by these studies of ethnic psychology. And so in trying to untangle these different lines in childhood, in ontogeny, we will occasionally have recourse to the historical picture, which tells us, gives us a pure picture of how these cultural stages of cultural development took place in human history. So for this reason, he says, we must turn to phylogenesis, which doesn't recognize a union and merging of both lines, in order to untangle the complicated knot that's formed in child psychology. And another quote, how are you going to do this then? So he says, elucidation of basic concepts, which is indispensable for a formulation of the problem of development of higher mental functions in the child, must be based at the present level of our knowledge of this problem on an analysis of how the human mind developed at sequential steps or stages of historical development. But where is such knowledge? What does he mean by that? Well, first and foremost, he means the studies like Lévi-Bruhl's and those of Thornwald and others. So in other words, he's having recourse to the so-called results and conclusions of ethnic psychology, so-called, or the studies of so-called primitive peoples, which Bukharin was referring to, in order to inform an understanding of ontogenesis. We need to look at how these particular researchers have understood the historical development of successive stages of human culture. Here he talks about the study of higher mental functions within a sociological study. He says this is factually supported only in recent decades in studies on ethnic psychology and can now be considered an incontrovertible position of our science. Culture, he says, creates special forms of behavior. It modifies the activity of mental functions. It constructs new superstructures in the developing system of human behavior. Okay. This is a basic fact confirmed for us by every page of the Psychology of Primitive Man, which studies cultural psychological development in its pure, isolated form. In the process of historical development, social man changes the methods and devices of his behavior, transforms natural instincts into functions, and develops and creates new forms of behavior, specifically cultural. In other words, what he's saying is that we've got studies which have confirmed for us the psychology of primitive man. That's it. We've got a good picture of so-called primitive man and the psychology of primitive man. And these studies give us that historical psychological development in its pure form, pure isolated form. But that pure isolated form is fused in ontogenesis with the continuing biological maturation, natural maturation of the child. So the natural and the historical or cultural are merged in that way. But to get a clear view of that cultural development in its successive stages, we go to ethnic psychology and these studies of so-called primitive peoples. I've done a little diagram there, but I won't go through it. So, how does this work then? Well, what Vygotsky is saying is that biological evolution produced modern Homo sapiens. And at that point, historically, that's where cultural development began. Cultural development began when the process of biological evolution had finished. So cultural development started on the basis, on the natural basis that evolution had provided. And cultural development can therefore be seen as the transformation or the capture or the social means of working through and transforming these natural means. So this is what he says. If we wanted to present the process that interests us in a pure, independent and uncovered form, and in this way to present the results of our analysis of rudimentary functions, we could say that this process consists in the transition from one form of behavior, the lower, to another, which we arbitrarily or conventionally call the higher. The line dividing the two forms is the relation of stimulus-response. Remember our discussion of reflexology and reflex theory in Vygotsky before. For one form, that's to say the natural form or the lower form, an essential characteristic shall be a full, in principle, determinacy of behavior by the stimulus. For the other, the cultural or the higher, the same essential characteristic is auto-stimulation, the creation and use of artificial stimuli devices, determining one's own behavior with their help. Creating and using artificial stimuli as auxiliary devices for controlling one's own reactions also serves as a basis for the new form of determinative behavior that distinguishes higher behavior from elementary. The presence of created stimuli together with the given stimuli seems to us to be the distinguishing characteristic of human psychology. So there are two things here that are very important, I think. First of all, there is the apparently uncritical or relatively uncritical acceptance of these studies of so-called primitive peoples and the primitive mentality and psychology of so-called primitive peoples as marking the initial stages, the early stages of human historical development, psychological development overall. In other words, these so-called primitive tribes, these people are actually showing us what our ancestors were. That's where we've come from. Though those people are at the lowest rungs of cultural development, a cultural development which we've gone through. And secondly, that the way this cultural development works is on the basis, the given basis of the outcome of the output of biological evolution, which creates a natural basis for psychological development in lower forms of psychological function, which are essentially those of instinct and conditioned response, reflexology. This final quote, for example, primitiveness in this sense is the lowest stage and starting point of man's historical development. Data about prehistoric man, about peoples at the lowest rung of cultural development, about comparative psychology of peoples of different cultures serves as material for the psychology of primitive man. And note what he says in the middle section. This is from studies in the history of behavior now. As a result of these changes occurring over a long period of time, a psychological type of modern cultural man, the European or American, was formed. We can only understand the features of this type if we also add the genetic point of view to their explanation, if we ask from where and how they originated. So in other words, what we have as a picture here is this modern cultural type, the European or American, or elsewhere in the same book, what Luria refers to as the average Parisian from Paris. We can ask where this type comes from. And of course, it comes via a process of historical development from the lowest stage and starting point, namely prehistoric man or peoples at the lowest rung of cultural development. Here is more about the primitive man and the cultural man and so on. And the point being that given the nature of the psychological theory that Vygotsky was developing, that in ontogenesis we have these two merged lines of natural and cultural, then in effect what we are saying about the development of human cultural development from so-called primitive peoples to your average Parisian, that process and those stages of development can be seen in ontogenesis. So in other words, the ontogenetic development is seen in the light of these ideas about the development of modern cultural peoples from their primitive ancestors. So on page 163, a child's primitive pre-cultural thinking, you see, primitive pre-cultural thinking of the child is constructed in a much simpler way than the adults. It's an immediate reflection of the naively perceived world. For the child, one detail, one incomplete observation may be enough for a corresponding inference. And it's exactly, I don't have time to quote it here, but it's in exactly those terms that Vygotsky and Luria describe the perception and the thinking of the so-called primitive man. The primitive man sees through an immediate reflection of the things in the perceived world and is incapable of abstraction and generalization. So I think we're left with these questions, and I've probably said enough now to to annoy you. To what extent is it plausible to imagine human beings as the product of these two lines of development, natural and cultural, in the precise way Vygotsky assumes? And where is the warrant for this in Marx? Do Marx's comments about this natural species connection in Capital, do they give some support to this kind of view? Secondly, does Vygotsky appear to be assuming a single historical line of development from so-called primitive people to modern cultural human beings? To what extent is this justified? And what confidence can we have in the results and analyses of ethnic psychology, so-called, in terms of a pure phylogeny of cultural behaviors, psychological functions, in the way described? The article on the socialist transformation of human beings, although that has got very interesting and insightful things, I think you will find it has a similar view. Is talking about the available factual material obtained mainly by comparing biological types of primitive peoples at the most primitive stages of their cultural development with representatives of the most culturally advanced races. This is what it's talking about. With Plekhanov. So how are we to view the relationship between the starting points and methodology of Vygotsky in relation to Marx's approach, particularly given the changes in Marx's own perspective on the vital questions of historical development, continuity, and unilinearity of human history? And what scope is there then for a unilinear or multilinear history of human psychological capacities? What would a theory of human psychological capacities look like that didn't assume a unilinear development? What are the assumptions that Vygotsky brings to his own perspective on the history of behavior? And how do these assumptions shape the distinctive principles and foundations of his new psychology? So some questions to think about there. And I'll just finish perhaps by saying what I thought would be important perhaps for us to do in the next seminars, if this suits you, which is to focus on what I think is the most important and central position of the whole of Vygotsky's psychology, which is the genetic law of cultural development, because this really takes in everything, all the main principles that we've been looking at, and it's applied in particular to the basic case of language development and speech. So we've got a nice germ cell type situation with both the general genetic law and its application to speech. What's the rationale for this genetic law? How does that rationale relate to Marx's work? And what assumptions are made in the development and articulation of this law about psychological development, about social interaction, about linguistic communication, and about thinking, particularly in the light of the quotations and passages that we've just been looking at in relation to the natural and cultural lines of development, I think. So, my friends, I thank you for listening. I know I've talked a lot and I've missed out quite a bit as well. So I will stop there, and I'm very interested in hearing your views and questions. So I will stop my sharing and I'll also shut up at that point. Thank you very much indeed.
Congratulations, Peter. Amazing discussion, very, very daring one, and challenging as well. I liked it very much because I've been reading a lot on neoliberalism, new capitalism, and as I said, necro-capitalism and necro-liberalism. And necropolitics. So I think that when you talk about this, you refer to one of the most important things that we as colonized have been discussing recently, that is the power of this colonization that blinds us many times to see within our own references the lack of attention to their own prejudices and their own forms of imposition. It's essential that we understand, as you pointed out, and I would like to comment this a little before we open to everyone to comment. I would like to point a little bit to the fact that when we talk about this decolonization, it has to do with separating, categorizing people and categorizing power, knowledge in different sets that put some as inferior and sees development not as a multicultural way of growing in different directions and possibilities, but in one single direction, and that direction is the direction of the colonizer. And this also points to the racist attitude that is behind this view, because in the end, there is this idea that some are considered superior because they had, I don't know what opportunities or what characteristics or what color that entitles them to feel that they are the ones who are the, and then when you were speaking, I was thinking, because in many ways, when Vygotsky talks about the development of the child, he says that the bud of the development is there. Why? Why is the adult superior to the child? In what ways? In many ways, the child, as our ancestors in the Abiyala here in the Americas say, in many ways, the child is closer to nature and to a superior way of thinking and being in the world than us, because we are too much infused with this capitalistic mentality, which put us apart from what real values our ancestrality, our spirituality can create for us. So in many ways, this is also a very colonial and very racist way of thinking about reality. But and I think that you pointed out things that were very interesting in this line, and I thank you very much. I'm just reacting because, you know, I'm very emotional about these issues, and recently I've been very touched by the discussions that we have had, mainly with those groups that are considered vulnerabilized I don't know if you have this, but that's how we prefer to say, not that they are vulnerable, but they are vulnerabilized, if that's possible in English, because that's what this kind of coloniality creates for groups that are normally set as inferior, like the LGBTQIP community, the Black people, the quilombolas, the indigenous, the blinds, the deaf, the women, and so on and so forth. So this is very strong for me. Well, I see that Luis Gonçalves has his hand raised, and I saw there was a comment by Deborah Cristina on the chat saying very pertinent considerations, and she also mentions Lukács, and when he talks about the ontology of the social being, the inorganic, organic, and social man. She says it's a good reading. I don't know if Luis would like to comment, if you want to comment on what I said first, or if you want to listen to me and Luis and then comment.
Well, I would just say thank you to you for that, what was a very moving contribution in a way that was superior to my own. I think the issue is that the colonizers had this view precisely because they were colonizers, and they enslaved, they captured, they transported, and they exterminated these people on a massive scale, and as such regarded them as inferior to their own cultures and civilizations. And as you said absolutely rightly, this colonizer's view has infused the entirety of Western thinking, not just in politics, in the obvious areas, you might say, but in the entirety of religion, philosophy, social theory, of course, but also psychology. And these sort of studies of so-called ethnic psychology were nothing but that. They were in effect a representation of the inferiority of the peoples who had been displaced or colonized, who were regarded as primitive ancestors that we'd moved away from. So the book that I quoted is interesting because it seeks to locate those problems in all of these modern social theories, including in Marx. While it's true that Marx moved away from these views progressively, as Anderson shows, he didn't overcome them. And in much of his work, you can find the same thing. His writings on India are shocking. And certainly writings on other things. And these people were revolutionaries, like the Bolsheviks, but their own views, their own perceptions of these things were no different, in effect, in terms of the principles that they'd absorbed. So I thank you for that, and I look forward to what Luis has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Luis, could you, if you want to speak Portuguese, Luis?
Bom dia. Obrigado,
Just a second, man. Those of you who are here and cannot speak in Portuguese, you can turn your interpretation into Portuguese, into English, sorry. Peter, you too. So, Luis, go ahead. Pode ir.
Bom dia, professor. Obrigado por mais uma palestra brilhante. Você não nos ajuda muito, você nos deixa mais inquietos, mais dúvidas, né? Mas eu queria fazer uns comentários aqui. E eu agradeço por essa inquietude, né? Primeiro, essa discussão me lembrou um pouco o que o Leontiev falou sobre como, no esforço pelo conhecimento, a gente está sempre, ao mesmo tempo, armado e limitado pelas representações e conhecimentos das nossas épocas e das nossas sociedades. Então, nós vamos estar sempre presos a esses limites, de uma certa forma, né? Nós temos que ter uma certa humildade para lidar com esse limite, né? Agora, estava pensando no que você estava falando, e assim, quando a gente olha para as diferenças entre os povos que inspiraram essas leituras eurocêntricas ou universalmente progressivas, né, no sentido positivista, eu pergunto como a gente pode discutir os processos de humanização sem nos perdermos nesses limites, né? Pergunto se um dos caminhos não é olhar para a relação que certos povos estabeleceram com o mais trabalho e o excedente, né? O excedente que surge do mais trabalho, e como outros povos prescindiram do excedente para a sua humanização. Então, se isso não é uma chave interessante, né? Por outro lado, quando a gente combina o que você resgatou aqui do Vygotsky, a questão do autoestímulo, né? O autoestímulo ele não é só um mecanismo de controle do comportamento, mas dentro da ideia de controle, a ideia de projeção de comportamento. Então, eu posso idealizar o que vai acontecer, né? Então, quando eu combino isso com o que o Marx trata do excedente, né? Como o excedente permitiu um tipo de humanização que possibilitou o desenvolvimento de um tipo de razão voltada por uma pretensão do que o Lukács chama de movimento livre na matéria, né? O desenvolvimento científico nessa direção do movimento livre na matéria, como a ciência proporciona para o ser social esse tipo de movimento, através do desenvolvimento tecnológico e tudo mais. E aí, para complementar, esse tipo de visão, né, de visão de pretensão, tem a frase, uma construção que o Kozik fala, e que ele diz que na filosofia materialista, né, sustenta que o homem, sobre o fundamento da praxis e na praxis, como processo ontocriativo, cria também a capacidade de penetrar historicamente por trás desse entorno de si, e, por conseguinte, de estar aberto para o ser em geral. E ele conclui: o homem está aberto à compreensão do ser sobre o fundamento da praxis e, por isso, é um ser antropocósmico. Então, queria conectar essas ideias de excedente, de movimento livre na matéria, de ser antropocósmico, e como a gente consegue dar um tratamento mais adequado para a questão do desenvolvimento, né? Ciência, desenvolvimento, excedente. Não sei se eu estou confuso, mas você me deixou um pouco confuso também, positivamente confuso. Muito obrigado.
Yes, and I apologize. I apologize for that. But I'm sure you're not any more confused than I am at the moment about things. So not as a result of your question, but unfortunately, the result of my own work. Yes, I mean these are profound issues, which I thank you for raising here. Lukács is an interesting example of someone, again, I think, who exemplifies this kind of universalistic view of human social and conscious development, with a particular picture, if you like, of the development of humanity and the kind of causes and direction of it. And I would want to question all of that, I think, and also I think in relation to the question that you raised about surplus as well. I mean, that was the general sort of Marxist view that societies can, once a surplus is produced, we're able to, live in a particular way and so on, and that the development of the productive forces, as understood, was the kind of driving force of historical development. But I don't think that either of those things can be seen as universally relevant or valid, even if we can define them. Because as we know, when we look at the diversity of humanity throughout the world, and we, of course, we know now that there were lots of different types of people at different stages in human history, and that people, loosely defined, have been doing their human thing on the earth in different parts, in different places, in different ways for hundreds of thousands of years, with some communities preserving their fairly stable ways of life for tens of thousands of years, albeit in, I'm sure, what Marx would have thought was a very low level of development of technology. So I think these things are all to look at differently. I think they're all to question and look at more carefully, I think, and in terms of a multilinear, multi-diverse picture, unlimited picture in effect of what humans may or may not be and what they have been. The complicating factor, of course, is that the world is absolutely dominated by destructive capitalist production, so that wherever people live in the world and whatever has been their history up to that point, we're all now partners, we're all collaborators now in a struggle against this system that's killing us all. And in that light, we need to be able to open ourselves to others, I think. We need to be able to work out those ways we can best collaborate and work together without judging one another's histories and cultures and so on. But we need to be able to find out ways that we can work together in all of this, in ways that we can collaborate and help one another to fight what is in effect our common enemy. And that is certainly a task that is worthy of consideration and thinking, I think. So, Luis, I thank you for your question. I know I haven't answered it, but you've given me even more food for thought after all that. So I thank you again.
Obrigada, Luiz. Agora a Ia também pediu a palavra e depois eu vejo aqui que tem duas colocações no chat também. Vou passar para vocês. Então, Ia, por favor. Please, Ia, if you can.
Well, okay, good morning, Peter. It's a pleasure.
Good to see you. Very good to see you.
It's wonderful to see her.
But I will speak in Portuguese, okay?
Okay.
I forgot my English here. Então, eu não sei nem se, na verdade, não é exatamente uma pergunta, mas é algo que está assim, fervendo na minha cabeça, com tudo que você falou, e agora acho que ficou mais intenso ainda com a última pergunta, né? Eu acho essencial, para mim é muito novo e importante a discussão da colonialidade, da colonização, dessa questão da diversidade. Foram questões muito importantes de eu ter ouvido agora, né? O risco de nós colocarmos os superiores e inferiores, enfim. Mas eu ainda fico com uma questão que eu não sei, quer dizer, assim, talvez o Luiz tenha caminhado um pouco, mas quando o Luiz coloca as condições do capitalismo, da história do capitalismo, da produção do excedente, e quando você fala, sua última frase, Peter, que você fala que é inegável que a gente vive sob um modo de produção destrutivo, né, um modo de produção capitalista que se renova, não sei se a palavra é essa, mas, enfim, que se torna cada vez mais destrutivo e antropofágico, porque com o neoliberalismo o que a gente percebe é que o neoliberalismo se apropria das necessidades das pessoas, mas a partir dos seus termos, né? Quer dizer, o neoliberalismo vai antropofagicamente apreendendo quais são as necessidades, quais são as construções simbólicas, e vai cada vez mais criando uma situação que as pessoas acreditam que são criativas, que são empreendedoras, que são livres. Enfim, quer dizer, a gente vive uma situação que é assustadora, né? Como existe uma crença e que, enfim, o papel da ideologia vem se cumprindo muito bem para a manutenção desse capitalismo destrutivo, né? E aí, então, eu fico pensando que, junto com toda essa discussão da colonialidade, como que você vê, como que a gente vê, enfim, eu fico pensando que existe na proposta marxista, e que, de algum modo, eu acho que o Vygotsky se apropria, mas, é claro, na medida que foi possível para ele naquele momento, mas principalmente na proposta marxista, eu acho que é colocado um rumo. que foi a primeira questão que você fala. Você fala, a psicologia marxista coloca o rumo, o Vygotsky coloca o rumo, como ele entende desenvolvimento. Então, aí, para mim, fica assim, eu reconheço, e tenho certeza, claro, que certeza não, nunca tenho certeza, mas acredito muito de que a gente não possa, e não deva, e não temos condições, né, de falar como vai ser o desenvolvimento. Mas eu ainda acredito que uma questão que é base para a discussão, para qualquer outra discussão, inclusive essa questão da colonização, de sermos colonizados e colonizados, que é a sociedade de classes. E aí eu fico pensando o seguinte, que o método materialista dialético, mesmo tendo que se repensar a todo momento, mesmo com todas as críticas que se faz a todo momento, eu acho que ele carrega em si a crítica. Eu acho que é essa a grande vantagem dele, né? Mesaros, eu acho que tem um livro do Mesaros que chama, acho que Ideologia e Poder, que ele fala que o materialismo histórico dialético ele se mostra como importante e útil nesse momento, mesmo considerando todos os atravessamentos colonizadores, mesmo considerando tudo isso, mas o materialismo dialético, neste momento, ele se coloca ainda como um método importante, em que aquele que pode gerar possibilidades de mudança, porque é um método que, neste momento, numa sociedade de classes, numa sociedade que camufla a realidade, que camufla as contradições, é um método, e eu vejo como único, capaz de propor a visualização, a explicitação dessas contradições, a explicitação da desgraça que é uma sociedade de classes. Então, eu fico pensando assim, que eu tenho um pouco de medo, de vez em quando, de nós... E aí, para mim, claro, eu acredito, e não quero esquecer, para mim é importante entender que, não que o rumo vai ser a sociedade XYZ, mas que o método do materialismo dialético, especialmente por conta das categorias historicidade, totalidade e contradição, e a compreensão da sociedade de classes, é ainda uma ferramenta essencial, até para se pensar a questão da colonização, colonidade, e para pensar todas essas questões. E eu, de vez em quando, fico com receio, porque eu fico aí, pode ser que eu seja meio jurássica, I don't know how to translate jurássico. I have a friend eu tenho uma amiga que fala que eu sou jurássica, né? Eu não quero ser ortodoxa, mas eu acho que, no método, eu acho que vale ser ortodoxo. Tem um texto, inclusive, acho que é o Luiz deve saber, Ortodoxia do Método, acho que é do Lukács, de quem que é? Do Mesaros, que fala que no método eu acredito que a gente tem que ser ortodoxo no sentido de levar até as últimas consequências, né? Então, não sei bem como, quando você falava essa coisa do rumo, e aí, assim, eu acho que aí isso não pode ser abandonado até para o rumo da discussão da colonização, e até para o rumo para se pensar o que é desenvolvimento psicológico. Eu acredito que desenvolvimento psicológico não que tenha que ser o desenvolvimento como nos desenvolvemos como os franceses, etc. e tal, mas eu vejo o desenvolvimento na possibilidade de cada vez mais o ser humano entender os processos históricos, entender que a sociedade é contraditória. Para mim, isso é desenvolvimento, para mim, isso combina evolução e revolução, para mim, isso seria uma revolução, né, nas funções psíquicas, né? Então, não sei como é que... sei lá, eu fiquei pensando nisso a partir da sua fala inicial e depois na discussão da colonização, colonidade, essas questões. Ok.
Marvelous. Thank you for all that. Thank you very, very much for those points. It's good to hear you as well and to see you again. That's great. Yes, there's a lot to say about that. In terms of Marx's own views, it's important, I think, to note that he did change his views on things. That's one thing, that he didn't have the same view in the 1840s that he had in the 1860s and 1870s, and that you could say, well, he had a method, yeah, but the method was telling him one thing in the 1840s, and it was telling him something different in the 1860s and the 1870s. So it was always in the end about trying to understand what was going on, and to make new steps, take new steps towards that understanding, while recognizing that sometimes what you thought was the method had been holding you back. And so in the 60s and 70s, Marx, in fact, did go through a remarkable and quite profound intellectual development himself, partly by his own study, partly by his study and commentary on events like the American Civil War, where obviously the plight of the black slaves and the Emancipation Proclamation and so on in the Civil War were very, very important factors in his thinking about what we would now call intersectionality, you know, the intersection of class and race and so on, as well as gender. So these were important things that certainly qualified or even modified some of the ways he thought about social contradictions, and in particular concrete social processes. And the Russian Revolution and the Russian revolutionary movement itself, his relationship with that and his contacts with the Russian revolutionaries in that late 19th century period also had a very profound effect on him for how he saw the possible development of Russian socialism and the role of the peasantry and of the peasant commune in that. So as well as a more general study of colonization, these things did enrich his views, and indeed he did change his views very radically on, for example, the Irish independence movement, as well as on the Russian revolutionary situation. Now, of course, you can say, well, yes, he did this according to the method, but as I say, that at one point the method was telling him this, another point the method was telling him that. So the method as such cannot ever be divorced from the actual engagement with the realities of social life and the concrete contradictions and problems and issues, which constantly throw up new problems that you've not anticipated, and that's what Marx had to deal with. Having said all of that, though, what I think we agree on is the following: that of course the method that Marx developed for capital, for understanding capitalist production and for the critique of bourgeois political economy, was nevertheless at the heart of his own contribution, because for him this system dominated the world. In other words, the contradiction between labor and capital, which he analyzed so exquisitely in his work on capitalist production, that for him was the agent, that capital was the agent which was drawing in and had drawn in all these people. So the colonization was an effect of, or had become a means or effect of capitalism, of world capitalist production. So that all of these things, while having their own momentum, their own history, their own rhythm, and their own issues, their own problems, which had to be dealt with concretely, nevertheless, at the center of it all was this was capital, which had become a personified force for the destruction of human productive power, and which needed to be ended. But he saw this towards the end of his life. He saw this in a more nuanced way in relation to the ways in which particular struggles could take a lead. So in other words, rather than in his earlier work thinking that the Irish people would not be independent until the English working class took power, now he started to think that the English working class would not advance until the Irish were independent and had won their independence struggle. And it was similarly in the Russian Revolution, if you remember, because while the Menshevik position was, yeah, we've got to wait for capitalism to develop in Russia, you know, it's too immature, we've got to hang on, there's nothing we can do at the moment, the working class is immature, we've got to wait for capitalist production to build up in Russia before we can think about a socialist revolution. The Bolsheviks said, no, the issue is that we have the opportunity here. Things have developed to such a sharp point here that the world revolution, including whatever socialist revolution there might be in England, that can be ignited by our struggle here in Russia. And that, you know, that was very much in keeping with the kind of thinking that Marx developed in those later years. And his thinking has similarly changed on India as well, in supporting the anti-colonial struggles and movements in India. So I think you're absolutely right that at the center of it all for Marx was the class struggle in terms of the labor capital struggle. But nevertheless, he saw that in much more nuanced terms in relation to the entirety of this world movement developing in all its in more of its complexities, and saw the importance of the anti-colonial struggle as a driving force itself for the labor capital struggle. And so you could say that his dialectical approach became more concrete, became more nuanced as he took these things on board towards the latter part of his life, I think. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question or helps with the thing, but just some thoughts, I think, on what that might give us. Thank you.
Can I just jump on?
Ajuda sim, viu, Peter? Ajuda. E aí eu fico pensando, talvez recolocando, que, pelo que você fala, eu fico achando que, por exemplo, a maneira como Lukács discute totalidade, a importância de entender o complexo de complexos, que é como ele define a totalidade, é essencial para que a gente compreenda todas essas relações que, inclusive, são desdobramentos das relações de classe. Quer dizer, assim, a noção de totalidade, eu acho que o Lukács traz, eu acho que ajuda muito a ter essa visão mais interligada com todos os outros fenômenos e processos que ocorrem, que se constituem com as classes e se desdobram e são diferentes. Eles têm que ser tratados separadamente, né? Mas, enfim, me ajudou, sim. Claro que também me ajudou a ficar um pouco mais com mais perguntas e mais dúvidas, mas, enfim, faz bem.
Obrigada aí, Peter. I was full of ideas to comment too, but I won't, because there are more questions here and we can talk later for sure. We only have 15 minutes. Just to say that Deborah has posed a question in Portuguese, so I will read it. And then if one of the translators can translate, I will thank you for that. So, e Leontiev, na obra Atividade, Consciência e Personalidade, escreve que a consciência surge no homem durante o processo de estabelecimento do trabalho e das relações sociais. A consciência, desde o início, é um produto social. Também Rubinstein, citando a ideologia alemã, não é a consciência que determina a vida, senão a vida que determina a consciência. Se for possível, o professor Peter comentar a partir dos nexos com a exposição, ela agradece. E aí eu já vou ler também a pergunta do Samuel, que diz: Is there any perspective of proper human development in the current global productive capitalist system? E a Débora vai concordar, então, com as colocações acho que foi da Ia, imagino, e do Peter. Eu vou abrir para o Peter falar, porque depois também o Luiz fez comentários, mas acho que a gente precisa primeiro dar tempo para ele pensar nisso. Okay.
Yes, thank you. So consciousness, human consciousness must be a social product because people are social beings. So everything we do as part of a community, part of a collective. Everything we learn to do, every way that we behave, all of all of our ways of communicating and thinking clearly, and of consciousness itself clearly develop in our activity, in our being part of that community, an active part of that community. So in that sense, consciousness can't exist on its own. It can't be in itself the cause of anything as such. It has to be seen as part of that active relationship of individuals to one another within the collective as a social product. So I think that is absolutely right. That doesn't mean to say, however, that we all might understand consciousness in any more detail in the same way. May have different views of what we mean by consciousness and how precisely do we become self-aware and conscious within a community. How does that actually happen? Is there a process that we can see and understand in that? We may have different views on that, and indeed I'm sure we will, and we'll perhaps look at that next time in terms of Vygotsky's work. So I thank you for that question. I hope I've answered it okay.
Okay, Peter, I don't know, I don't know if you put together Samuel and Deborah in your answer. Did you?
I possibly did. I'm sorry. Could you repeat? Could you repeat the one that I missed?
Samuel asked, is there any perspective of a proper human developed in the current global productive capitalist system? I don't know if you try to combine. I felt as if you did, but I'm not sure.
No, sorry, I didn't. I missed that one. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No.
Well, I would say yes. The prospect is in the struggle against that. That's our only prospect. In effect, is to take up the struggle for a better world, and that in that struggle, I think, in all its forms, in all its diverse ways, to which we can contribute. I think that is the prospect for the development of our own humanity, and our self-awareness as human beings. I think it must, however horrible the world is, at least we recognize that horribleness, don't we? And that's the starting point. We are self-conscious and self-conscious enough to recognize that this is not a world that we want to live in, and that we want to change it, and it's in that, and in the struggle against that world and for a better world. I think that constitutes our prospect for development, I would say. I hope that says something relevant to your question.
Thank you, Peter. I think we don't have more questions, so I will use this last minutes to ask one more, to comment on what EF said and what you answered, and then open for your comments and conclusions. I was thinking that perhaps if we think just like Silvia Almeida, Brazilian researcher, just discussed about the rereading that Bembe made of Foucault idea of biopolitics into necropolitics and what the differences are. And I think that the way Almeida discusses this movement of Bembe is very good, because one thing that he mentions is, it's not that we are saying that what Foucault said is bad. No, what Foucault said is limited by his context. So what Bembe is proposing is an expansion of his ideas, considering the new developments that the world and other theories have taken into the ground for us to reflect on. So this decolonial perspective that these different authors are presenting, and not all of them, but the ones that I was mentioning, I think that it has to do not on saying what Marx said was bad, but what Marx said was not complete in terms of the reality that we live, because he was not there. And then because I am an Spinozian, I can say that from a Spinozian perspective, we don't have full knowledge of the totality. We are partial beings. And as partial beings, and with temporally determined, we cannot think as we beyond the limits of our reality. We can try, but we will never. So I think that this gives us an opportunity to move beyond and learn from and with these people, but create beyond what they did. And I think that what you present today is not to say we don't believe in Vygotsky anymore. No way. I do believe, I fight for him and for Marx, and we are eternally thankful to them. But we move forward. We don't stop on what they said, because we are not living the lives that they lived. And I think that this is very essential for us as researchers and as human beings, to think that we are developing people, transforming the reality that is in transformation while we are transformed by it in Marx ways. So I just pass to you to make your final remarks and for us to conclude our session, brilliantly conducted by you.
Well, thank you again, and I wish that contribution had been my final contribution. So you said it so beautifully. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. We're not talking about right or wrong here. As such, we're looking at the limitations of things, and as we know, these theories have become so important for us, haven't they? They've been important for us academically and professionally. They've been important for us morally in terms of our ethical grounding, and they've been important for us very important in political and social terms. So we're highly invested in these ideas, and we're not. I'm certainly not proposing that we abandon them, but because they were written in particular times, in particular contexts, it's important to have a close look, I think, and ask some very disturbing questions sometimes about the limitations of these works from our current perspective. Because in the end, the only thing that matters is how may we best understand what we're doing in order to change the world. And to this, we look to our great teachers. We look to Vygotsky and Marx. We look to Leontiev and others as inspiring figures in the struggle to understand what we need to do and how the world needs to be. And so we will never abandon them, but at the same time, we have to build on what they did and try to see the flaws and limitations so that we can better proceed, I think. So I think that's how I would put it. And next time we'll continue that work, I think, with some of Vygotsky's work.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cissa, Adolfo, Vivi, that are organizing this seminar. I would like to thank all the participants who are here and on the in the internet, Facebook, and I hope that we can be full of these ideas that we discussed today, very infused by then, for us to go voting on our next election day, because all of the things that you brought to us today also makes us reflect on how we see ourselves and how we are going to decide our futures in our different countries within a context that is so, I mean, destructive to us all. So I thank you all, and say goodbye to people on Facebook, and ask people who are here to open